Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consol, your host. Two quick things before introducing you to my guest. First, I encourage you to subscribe to this podcast by clicking on the follow button and also clicking on the bell icon so you are alerted to each new edition of the program. Second, in addition to being the producer of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I've written 4 books, 3 novels, and 1 short story collection. In the episode notes, you will find a short link to my Amazon page and all 4 of those titles. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is Jesse Kavadlo. He is actually a repeat guest because he was on the program probably a couple of years ago now when we talked about Don DeLillo. He's one of the Don DeLillo experts out there. Now, Don DeLillo is still alive and hopefully well, but he's not one to do interviews, let alone podcasts. So brought in a couple of experts to discuss Don DeLillo and his incredible writing career. But we have Jesse on the program today for a different reason. Based on decades of work as a professor of literature and as a musician, Jesse Kavadlo analyzes the ways in which the 1980s heavy metal aligns with and develops many of these themes prevalent in the canon of literature. Now, this has to do with his new book called Rock of Pages. In doing so, the book examines some of the context of the 1980s heavy metal scene, including the Cold War, the rise of MTV, the formation of the Parents Music Resource Center. If you remember that, Al Gore's wife, Tipper Gore, led the charge on that one, and subsequent congressional hearings. So Rock of Pages takes the Parents Music Resource Center's own objections to heavy metal and uses them as titles and topics to analyze the intersections between heavy metal and literature. Jesse Kavadlo, welcome back to Novelist Spotlight.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Hey, so what was your inspiration for this book? I mean, you have decades of work as a professor of literature, and but was the idea for the book something that came along many years ago, or was it just a few years ago that you decided you could put these observations to work?
It was really just a few years ago, and it's one of those things that in retrospect, it seems really obvious this is what I should have been working on, but it didn't quite occur to me at the time. I've been teaching for a long time. I taught my first college class in 1994. I've been at Maryville University of St. Louis since 2004. And then about 13 years ago, I started playing music again after basically giving up at age 23. My teenage dream was I was going to be a rock star. I wrote my own music. I learned how to play the guitar, the bass, keyboard, singing. I was in a whole bunch of hard rock bands in Brooklyn, New York, where I'm from. I stayed in school while I was doing this, figuring I'd be a really big rock star at any moment now. And then I found that I graduated college and still wasn't a rock star. So I started a master's degree, kept playing, finished the master's degree, and I still wasn't a rock star. Was able to get into and enrolled in a PhD program and decided at this point, I guess this is just what I'm doing now, and stopped playing. And then in retrospect, maybe giving up music at age 23 was a little bit hasty. So 13 years ago, I started playing again, doing covers this time, not original songs. Got more and more into it until in 2019, I joined a Midwestern 80s hard rock tribute band called Top Guns. We play all over the place. We play some big stages. We've got laser lights. We've got smoke machines. We wear wigs. We wear spandex. And it occurred to me that
Amazing.
that I was really living a double life at this point. I was doing my professor gig from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And then I was doing these weekend cover gigs. And it seemed to me that this was a really great way to bring the two worlds together, but also to analyze some of the friction that existed between them, the way in which 80s heavy metal in particular was and maybe is still considered the dumbest form of music that people came around on Bob Dylan a long time ago, 100 books written about Bob Dylan, rightfully so, movies, Nobel Prize in Literature, which I personally think should have gone to Don DeLillo.
There you go.
And Bruce Springsteen, and even recently Kendrick Lamar, Taylor Swift, awards, college classes, accolades, analysis, and yet 80s heavy metal still music by and for dummies. And it occurred to me that I could really think about this and talk about this and write about this very differently, that I wanted to make the connections to literature, but I also wanted to analyze the music as literature, which is something that again has happened with some of the folk greats and some of the more recognized academic names. Punk for a long time has been academically analyzed and brought into the kind of literary canon. But here's this one last genre of music that was left in the dust, but it was my genre. It was the one that I grew up with, that I played, that was near and dear to my heart. And so a couple of years ago, I thought, this is what I want to write about. And in retrospect, again, it seems very clear and obvious that this is what I've been working on all along for decades and decades, but it took me a while to figure that out.
Now, let me ask, how close to becoming a rock star? There's so many young men who dreamt of that, and young women who dreamt of it. My brother was one of them. He became a restaurateur instead when he found out, well, I'm not going to make a living a real at this, so I better do something else. Did you ever feel like you were on any kind of breakthrough when you were rocking out in your teens and 20s?
It did feel like it was pretty close. The band that I was in had some good gigs. The big rock club in Brooklyn was L'Amour, where you saw lots of major acts come through on their way up. In the mid 80s, Metallica played there, Wasp played there, Slayer played there, Anthrax played there. A bunch of other really big bands did so-called secret shows. Kiss played there, Iron Maiden played there, and I played there a whole bunch of times, opening for some bands that also never quite got big, but they got a little closer than I did. So for the real 80s, hard rock, hair band, metalheads, I played with or opened for Danger Danger, Dangerous Toys, Enough's Enough. If that doesn't sound familiar to you, that's because they never really broke big, but they did get record deals, unlike me. And we did play some shows in front of hundreds and even occasionally thousands of people. So it felt like it was pretty close. But then we recorded a bunch of demos. We recorded one demo in particular that did make its way to a major label, and the label passed on it. And that sort of felt like, okay, I guess we had our shot.
Yeah, boy, I can imagine what that was like. Now, today, the playing that you do today, and you're doing covers, are you doing 1980s covers?
We are doing 1980s covers, and pretty much the supernova hits of the biggest groups, the Van Halen songs, the Def Leppard songs, the Guns N' Roses songs, the Poison songs, the stuff that people really expect when they see the wigs and spandex.
So now you are looking with 40 years of hindsight. What do talk about the connection between heavy metal music from the 80s and the canon of literature?
Yeah, I mean, there are some pretty clear and easy ways in that there are several groups. Iron Maiden comes to mind right away. Metallica comes to mind, that really were inspired by works of literature. Iron Maiden's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, based on the poem by Coleridge. Metallica's For Whom the Bell Tolls, based on an Ernest Hemingway novel. So those were there, but that wasn't quite what I was thinking or getting at, even though there is a little bit of that to be found. What I was really thinking was the way in which a lot of these bands, including the hair bands of the 1980s, but certainly also the heavier bands, or what was considered heavy at the time, Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax, the way in which they really captured to me this interesting moment in history and cultural history that was all about something like celebrating the imagination, all about some version of escape and escapism without ever really losing sight of the conditions of the things that they needed to escape from. And that to me was what was very interesting, because it struck me as this is very much what I think we aspire towards with literature. The idea that somehow we can take on any number of different personas and perspectives, that we can take on the perspective of both the perpetrator of violence as well as the victim, that it can explore the sort of imaginary sides of madness, of the occult, of Satan, of Satanism, of what it feels like to lose one's mind, to experience death. In many ways, this has really been the province of all sorts of imaginative literature and philosophy. But for a brief moment, this was the primary form of music that was interested in these, what to me are very literary topics, was 80s heavy metal. I take the lyrics very seriously, but I also take them in conjunction with the music. Like, I'm not really sure that they were ever meant to be taken separate from music, so I am analyzing lyrics a lot in the book, but I'm trying, whenever possible, to take it within the context of the music and the song, and then the larger context of how did people experience this music at the time? Was it in the form of an album, a concert, a video? And I think all of those things are relevant. I also think that a lot of, again, so-called party band Van Halen, a lot of the lyrics were darker than it might have seemed at the time. I mean, I think, again, we're used to the videos with the tight trousers and David Lee Roth flying across the stage on a wire. Eddie Van Halen himself with the amazing, Frankenstein guitar, Frankenstrat guitar, smiling and smiling. But they're arguably some of their big, breakthrough songs, something like Running with the Devil, or then their real breakthrough song eventually in 1984, 85 with Jump. There's a lot of darkness to these songs. So it's sort of like they're a party band, but with this much darker side to them. You get just lyrics in Running with the Devil. I live my life like there's no tomorrow. This is the ethos of the whole 1980s. This apocalyptic mentality. What does it feel like to consider that we're sort of in this end point of history, that the Cold War is looming, apocalypse is looming? Looking back, a lot of these bands were really, really thinking about the end of the Cold War, even if they didn't know it was the end at the time, or the possibility of nuclear catastrophe. If you look at a lot of the videos, they were very strongly influenced by movies like Escape from New York or The Road Warrior. Again, this really post-apocalyptic sensibility. And the music, again, it's fun, but it doesn't lose track of what we need to have fun for. In some ways, Prince, not heavy metal, but very high in my estimation, gets this almost too close to the bone in something like 1999, where he explicitly says, talks about destruction, and tonight we're going to party like it's 1999. That was the ethos of the metal bands too, except they were going to party like it was 1989.
Yeah, wow. I saw Van Halen on their first tour. They opened for Ted Nugent and got to hand it to Ted Nugent to let Van Halen go out on stage ahead of him. It's such a theatrical and exciting band to watch live. And then here comes Ted. My ears rang for 3 days after that concert. And then you mentioned 1999. What a huge hit album that was. I was a huge fan of that album. I don't, other than Purple Rain, I felt like Prince never really equaled it again. In the book, you've got these various chapters. Chapter 2, V is for violence. Elaborate on that. I mean, you've been, talking about kind of this very dark vision, this apocalyptic vision in a lot of the lyrics and maybe the attitudes of the bands that were around at the time. So what about V is for violence?
As you mentioned in the intro, Mike, the other context of the book is those PMRC hearings from 1985. That's the Parents Music Resource Center. That's Tipper Gore, former wife of Al Gore, or was at the time wife of Al Gore. Susan Baker, wife of Reagan's secretary, Treasury Secretary James Baker. And they were very concerned at what they saw as the smut and sadism, to use a quotation from Tipper Gore, of rock lyrics. They put together what they called the Filthy 15, the 15 songs that were the absolute worst offenders. It's worth mentioning that Prince was at the top of the list. The song that got Tipper Gore's goat was Darling Nikki, with its reference to masturbation. But 9 of the other 15 were heavy metal songs. And so the original goal of the PMRC was to have content warnings for different songs, as opposed to what we know wound up happening, which is that the record companies kind of capitulated and came up with that sticker that everybody knows, the black and white sticker that says parental warning, explicit lyrics. But that wasn't what the PMRC wanted. They wanted labels that specifically mentioned V for violence, for songs that had violent lyrics, DA for drugs or alcohol, if they were referenced in the songs, X for sexually explicit lyrics, and O for lyrics about the occult. And so those are the chapters that I run with, because even though some of the earlier heavy metal apologists wanted to say, hey, look, those weren't really the topics of these songs. I'm okay saying, yes, they were. Those songs were about violence, drugs, alcohol, sex, and the occult. And those categories are great. Those are the great literary categories that writers have been writing about for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that when in the particular chapter that you're referencing, V for Violence, you've got, again, the sort of obvious way in with somebody like Shakespeare or any number of, Elizabethan through Victorian through modern works that really do revolve around violence, around revenge, around bloodbaths. And yet at the same time, they display all these other concerns about power, about who has autonomy or who has power over somebody else, about justice. And so you get a couple of songs in particular that were targeted for this, mainly revolving around Twisted Sister, which sounds a little funny now
Hmm.
because I think in most people's memories, they seem a little cartoonish, but they were cartoonish. And that was very much, I think, the point. Tipper Gore targeted two of Twisted Sister songs. One of them was on the Filthy 15. It was We're Not Gonna Take It, which has since wound up in any number of soundtracks and children's movies. Um, and then in one of her editorials in New York Newsday, which as it happened was Dee Snider's hometown paper, she targeted the song Under the Blade. And Under the Blade came up a lot at the actual PMRC hearings, which Dee Snider, singer of Twisted Sister, showed up for. He was the only musician who had a song on the Filthy 15 who actually showed up for the hearings. To their credit, Frank Zappa and John Denver also showed up. And I think the sentiment was that maybe John Denver, who is much more of a soft rocker, was going to be an apologist for the lyrics, but he absolutely was not. He stood up for the independence of musicians. Um, and so Dee Snider wanted to make it very clear that Tipper Gore was misreading his lyrics and that Under the Blade was not, in fact, a song about violence. He suggested that it was a song about dental surgery, and that's what he said on the Senate hearing. This to me is all really interesting for a lot of reasons. One is that I was a 13-year-old watching those PMRC hearings at the time in 1985. But what I understand much better now, after teaching literature for decades, in retrospect, is that what they were talking about was really literary criticism. How does one interpret lyrics? How important is the author's intention? How important is the audience or the listener? How important is the context? Is it possible to have correct readings, misreadings, or wrong readings? And that was one of the big ways in for me in terms of understanding what I wanted to do with this book, because what seemed to be, and for them was an argument about censorship on the one hand, if you were a musician, or lyrics that have gone too far if one is a parent, or that parent particularly is Tipper Gore in the 1980s. But aside from that, they were really talking about hermeneutics. They were talking about the power of interpretation. And so that's what I try to run with in each one of these chapters. What are they talking about? How does it connect to the ways that we think and talk about how one interprets a text? And what are some of the valid readings? So I definitely want to push back on Tipper Gore, who's continued to use words like sadism to describe these lyrics, which they don't really. And if you look at the lyrics to We're Not Going to Take It in particular, there is absolutely nothing violent in those lyrics whatsoever. And so for the Senate hearing, she had to show the video for We're Not
Yes.
Going to
Don't they
Take It.
throw their parents out the window
Yeah.
or something like that?
Yeah, so there is a lot of violence in that video, but as Dee Snider pointed out, it is a very clearly a form of slapstick violence, a kind of cartoon violence. It's very hard to take the violence in that video seriously, but you are right that it is the parent figure, the father figure, who keeps getting thrown out the window, in that, which probably felt much better as a kid watching that than maybe a parent watching that.
Yes, certainly. And you mentioned Frank Zappa, and I do remember the late great Frank Zappa sitting in front of the PMRC Congressional Committee and calling Tipper Gore and her cohort there a bunch of sexually frustrated housewives with nothing better to do with their time.
Yeah, yeah. So Frank Zappa suggested that, and then Dee Snider also, in a quotation, suggested that if Tipper Gore is seeing sexual violence in these lyrics, and that only exists in the mind of Tipper Gore. So they really turn that around. But I do also want to push back against Dee Snider a little bit too. That is, he is the writer of those lyrics. So shouldn't Dee Snider have the final word on what the lyrics to Under the Blade mean? But as anybody who's been studying literature for at least 30 or 40 years knows, there's been this push against the author is the key or the only one who really understands the lyrics or the literature. There's been this push from philosophers like Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault that we want to empower listeners and readers to create their own meanings, that the text is this something like dense tissue of interconnected texts that's ripe for understanding. And I think that really is valuable in some ways, because when you look at the lyrics and listen to the song of Under the Blade, it most certainly does not sound like it's about dental surgery. It sounds exactly like it's about being murdered by a knife-wielding slasher in an alleyway. And to me, that's important too, because there's nothing wrong with the song, even if it's about that. This is, again, another kind of fantasy of violence and power. And there were lots of hard rock songs, heavy metal songs about knife-wielding slashers. Iron Maiden had one. Judas Priest had one. Twisted Sister had one. In the satire This Is Spinal Tap, there is even a joke about post-retirement. The guys in Spinal Tap will finally get to write their Jack the Ripper musical, Saucy Jack. So this was already, by the time we got to the Senate, the PMRC hearings, it was already kind of a pretty established, almost cliche trope in hard rock lyrics. So the question then is, why? What does it mean? And my conclusion is that in some ways it was very similar to the horror movies that were very popular at the time, that went hand in hand with a lot of the heavy metal music. Headbangers Ball debuted on MTV, and a lot of the advertisements, which you can still see on YouTube, were for horror movies. Lots of heavy metal bands provided the soundtrack for horror movies. It seemed very much in keeping with, again, the kind of roller coaster ride, the thrill ride that one gets when watching a horror movie, or in this case, listening to a song with violent lyrics. The PMRC seemed to be really concerned that kids were going to become perpetrators of violence, or I suppose victims of violence. But the interesting thing to me was that young people didn't feel victimized by these songs. They felt empowered by these songs.
Interesting. And today, what do you think about today when you see now they've moved on to books and they're banning books left and right? And some of this has to do with sexual content, some with violence, I suppose. It's amazing some of the authors who have actually been banned from local libraries, local school libraries. But then there's also the whole transgender books, transgender books and so on that have alarmed religious conservatives.
Yeah. And as I discuss in the book, that one of the other things that went with this fear of heavy metal was also related to the larger satanic panic that engulfed Dungeons and Dragons at the time. And looking back, it's hard to think of a safer activity for teens than playing Dungeons and Dragons in the 1980s. And so to me, again, it some of it does come down to that there are some adults who are very poor judges of what's suitable for young people, and that they are concerned that this art is going to something like take something away from kids, turn them into perpetrators, cause and affect relationships, like if they listen to songs about violence or listen to songs about Satan, and there were certainly plenty of those too, that will nudge them to be violent or to be Satanists. And I think that there's something like that that's happening at the same time now, that seeing this kind of very straightforward cause and effect between what young people read or listen to and what they do wasn't right in the 80s, and it's not right now. These are works of the imagination, and these are works that help young people form their identity and find their people. And I think those things are amazingly valuable. In terms of book banning now, much like the worry in the 1980s, I think the Washington Post did a really good article about this a couple of years ago. It's a relatively small number of people that are pushing to challenge large numbers of books. That in one of the studies, I think it's just a small handful of people, like half a dozen people have challenged hundreds of books in some of the different school districts. So it's not widespread and it's not everybody, but it's definitely enough people who are vocal, who feel very strongly that kids aren't smart enough, as opposed to just not old enough to understand what they're getting out of their entertainment, their music, their books. In the V for Violence chapter, I started out with an analogy with Edgar Allan Poe, with two of his more famous works that are very frequently taught to young people, The Telltale Heart and The Raven. And in The Telltale Heart, the whole way of understanding this book is that we have to understand that this is an unreliable narrator. And that seems crucial to it. In other words, we're not thinking a guy named Edgar Allan Poe went out and committed a murder. A summary of the story, which I think most people know, this is a unhinged character becomes obsessed with another person's eye and decides to kill him. He's questioned by the cops, but he hears his own heart beating, thinks it's the heart of the old man, and confesses. That summary gives us nothing. The point of the story is the feeling, the thrill, the narration, the interiority of this character. And that's my sense of a lot of the heavy metal songs too. These are unreliable narrators. They're persona driven, but they weren't given enough credit for their intelligence or their artistry. It was just, Dee Snider, Twisted Sister wants to slash people. Iron Maiden gleefully singing about slashing people. Meanwhile, at the center of the Western canon, you've got Shakespeare, whose most famous plays do indeed involve people slashing each other to pieces and everybody dies. I want to hope that that's different. But if anything, in 2026, Mike, what you're saying is a greater concern. What I was hoping was that the literature might give 80s heavy metal a little bit more cachet. Something like Edgar Allan Poe and Shakespeare and lots of other literary masters were routinely writing about violence, the occult, and to some extent, in Shakespeare anyway, sexuality. So give heavy metal the same credit. I'm worried it's going the opposite direction. Heavy metal was objectionable for these reasons, and so is literature, which is very much not the point I was trying to make.
The people involved in the banning of books, they haven't even read these books in most cases. And when 60 Minutes did a segment on this, that you get a group of people in one school district, and then they send that list out nationally to other religious conservatives around the country, and then they just take hold of that list and say, we want these books banned. Well, they haven't even read them. They don't know why they need to be banned or the rationale for banning them, other than we don't want our children reading this stuff. Well, I mean, parents used to say, well, I control what my kids have access to. Today, it's almost silly because it's virtually impossible to control information flow to children today with social media and so on, unless you absolutely, ban them from laptops and phones and not visiting friends who have them and so on. I wanted to get to Don DeLillo for a second because he wrote one of his books was about a rock band, a rock band, Great Jones Street. Did you ever read that DeLillo book?
I did. I love Great Jones Street. That to me is one of his, I guess, lesser known and maybe lesser acclaimed novels, but it is actually one of my favorites. I mean, my favorite has to be, White Noise, and then you get the true masterpiece, Underworld. I love Libra, but then pretty much right after that, for me, it's Great Jones Street. I think he was onto a whole bunch of things. I do write about Great Jones Street. It might sound like a funny place, but it's in the chapter about drugs and alcohol, in part because in Great Jones Street, he's writing this, I think, in 1974, so earlier than most of the musicians and albums that I'm writing about. But he's already aware of what I'm thinking of, what I'm calling the kind of narrative of rock stardom. What in Great Jones Street he refers to as the contract, or what in White Noise, which I tie in again also when the character Murray Siskind is lecturing about Elvis, that Elvis understood the terms of the contract. And I'm going to get the quote a little bit wrong after that, but it's bloatedness, deterioration, substance, death. He sort of understood what his role in society was. And that to me is really interesting about this rock star narrative. Do we want and need our rock stars to go through this kind of cycle? Great Jones Street also teases that the narrator, main character, Bucky Wunderlich, is a rock star in seclusion, and maybe he'll die by suicide. Maybe he'll even be murdered by some of his admirers. The plot revolves around a conspiracy of a drug but without giving away too much, it's not any of the drugs you might possibly think of. Um,
Hmm.
and so to me, DeLillo seemed to he said in an interview that there was very little about rock music in Great Jones Street. He was really just, using this as a way to kind of riff a little bit. But I think there's definitely,
Just as he did with End Zone, like how much of that's
yeah,
really about football? It's
right,
just
right.
the canvas for him expressing a lot of other ideas.
And then I think that's some of the idea about a lot of DeLillo's like kind of first wave of novels is he was playing around with genres so that this way he could kind of experiment with perspective and the voice and humor and all sorts of other things. But I think he was actually right on about rock stardom without even quite knowing it. Some of the major rock star deaths were still fresh in the public consciousness. It's Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison. Bob Dylan had recently retreated from public kind of the public eye. And he was, I think, really thinking about some of his usual topics like reclusion, fame, stardom, death, uh, one's relationship with something like public life. And the rock star wound up being a good metaphor for that, but also not a metaphor at all. And I think he was really right on with that. And just the way in which the book is so much about excess and how rock stars definitely followed suit with that. It's also a way in that particular chapter for me to break from or maybe push back against my own ideas in the previous chapter about violence, which is on the one hand, I think it's very important to take much of what we're seeing as persona, as literature, as metaphor. And yet, when it comes to drugs and alcohol in the songs, many of the lyrics are cautionary tales. That to me was the really interesting part. One of the Filthy 15 songs that the PMRC targeted was the Black Sabbath song Trashed, which is not one of their most favorite famous songs. Ozzy Osbourne is not singing on it. It's former Deep Purple singer Ian Gillan, not one of their more famous ones. It's on the Born Again album. If you listen to Trashed, it's really clear this is an anti-alcohol song. This is about the dangers of drinking and driving, of taking one's life into one's own hands. And singer Ian Gillan had been pulled over for drinking and driving, so he was taking this in some ways very seriously. And yet the PMRC are not interested in any of the nuance of that. Any mention of drinking becomes labeled. This is drug and alcohol glorification, even though the song, I think, very clearly is not, both in the music and the lyrics. The challenge, though, is that Ian Gillan and then James Hetfield of Metallica with their song Master of Puppets, which is also arguably an anti-drug song, or Ozzy Osbourne with his song Suicide Solution, which was the subject of an actual lawsuit suggesting that he was telling his fans to kill themselves, when even a cursory glance at the lyrics reveals that this is an anti-alcohol song. And Ozzy was, of all things, clever. That if you look at the title and the opening lines, wine is fine, but whiskey's quicker. Suicide is slow with liquor. Suicide Solution is an actual pun. The solution being both, solving the thing, but also a liquid. And he's suggesting that people are slowly killing themselves with alcohol, including himself. So again, not given enough credit for their something like intelligence, but at the same time, this is again the break from chapter one where I insist on reading a lot of this metaphorically and literarily. The rock stars themselves really were suffering. So my thought of this is there are some limits to the literary. At what point do we want to be more literal and take some of these songs as more of a cry for help? And to me, some of the drug and alcohol songs fall into that category. The way in which Tipper Gore was so concerned about the danger posed to children by this music, when in retrospect, there is no danger, there was no danger, but arguably there was a danger to the rock stars themselves, whose mortality and morbidity rates are alarmingly high.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you play any of the Filthy 15 when you're out on stage?
What's funny is that when you look at the list now, and again, I'm going to exclude the non-heavy metal songs because I didn't talk about them. So many of them to me feel so much like afterthoughts. Like they honestly didn't even put that much time into it. So again, you get Black Sabbath's Trashed, not one of their famous songs, even a little bit. Def Leppard is on the list for the song Saturday Night High and Dry as glorifying drinking and drugs. Again, Def Leppard had a string of smash hits, and that was not one of them. It's basically just a kind of English pub song that barely glorifies alcohol, although it does refer to drinking. If you look at the occult songs, the two bands were Venom, which again, they had their fans, but Venom never broke really big or anything like that. And Merciful Fate, who were famous for their singer King Diamond, who wore face paint that wound up basically being ripped off by the Insane Clown Posse. Merciful Fate never broke big in America at all. So you sort of look at these songs, and you're like, huh, what a strange selection. You throw in the couple of other ones that round it out, and you've got Wasp. Mike, are we cursing on this podcast or are we not cursing on the podcast?
You can curse. It's okay.
Okay, so that was the issue was after Prince's Darling Nikki, the actual poster child for this was Wasp. Their first album had not yet come out, but their single released in England was called Animal Fuck Like a Beast. And so the cover for this featured a circular saw codpiece surrounded in blood. It was actually singer Blackie Lawless wearing this codpiece. The song does have a curse word in the title. They thought they could go really far with this one. And yet, even if you look at the lyrics to this song in retrospect, but maybe even at the time, aside from the use of the actual F word, which they were polite enough to boulderize using 2 asterisks, there's really not a lot here, which is again, like the need to bring in the we're not going to take it video. The PMRC seemed to have less to work with than maybe they originally thought, because this was an obscure song that hadn't even been released in the US yet. They needed this violent poster with the circular saw on it to try to help make their case. As it turns out, that song was never put on Wasp's debut album the way it was planned. And singer Blackie Lawless laments that he is very sure that even though people say, all publicity is good publicity, that they benefited from being on the Filthy 15, he is sure that they did not. He is pretty sure they would have actually broken bigger if PMRC had not pushed back against them. So no, it turns out we don't do any of these Filthy 15 songs because none of these Filthy 15 songs, aside from, again, the Prince song, and We're Not Gonna Take It, which we do. None of them were famous at all. The other heavy metal song that I think rounds this out, unless I'm forgetting one, is Judas Priest's Eat Me Alive, which, again, it's hard to search for and find literature in a song called Eat Me Alive. I'm not sure it aspires to be literary, but the thing that's interesting to me is, again, how absolutely tame it seems and sounds compared to what the subsequent 30, 40 years have added to lyrics and pop culture. You go back to Wasp and, Fuck Like a Beast. Less than 10 years later, Nine Inch Nails had a very similar lyric in their song Closer. I want to fuck you like an animal. And there were no hearings, no Filthy 15, no PMRC. Instead, music critics loved it, and VH1 eventually called it the best video of its era. And so it's an interesting thing to happen. A little bit after that, Nickelback also had a song called Animals about having sex in cars, if having sex in cars was something that animals actually did. Def Leppard had a huge hit with a song called Animal, where the lyrics are actually kind of racy, but there's no curse words, so it gets a pass. And then about 10 years ago, Maroon 5, pop rockers Maroon 5, had a hit with a song called Animal that managed to use the line Eat You Alive and could take what was objectionable about both the Judas Priest song and the Wasp song, and that song wound up breaking the top 40 and being used in a Kia car commercial. So this is sort of, again, the looking back part is, what were they so angry about? What were they so worried about? And to tie it back into what you were suggesting earlier about the current push for book challenges and book bans, to me, it's a lot about power and control. It's about parents having, again, a kind of moral panic about in 2026 what their kids are able to find and see and what they are potentially exposed to. And they're going over the one thing that they think they have some control over, which is school reading lists, as opposed to, again, what you're suggesting, which is the actual lived experience of what young people are able to find if they look for it. So these songs were about power, anti-authoritarianism, rebellion. It's natural in some ways that the authorities themselves would push back on it.
What about O for the occult? Occultism probably scares people more than anything. They associate it with the devil, although it's not necessarily associated with the devil or evil. It definitely scares people, probably more than sex, drugs, alcohol, violence, although they probably would say it's all rooted in evil. And when you say occult, they think evil. What about that chapter, O for occult?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this was a very fun and exciting chapter for me because the occult, and especially Satan and Satanism, you sort of take the fantasy of violence in something like a slasher, like the, again, Under the Blade, Killers, the Ripper, the Judas Priest song of that name. And that is one kind of fantasy of power. And then you have fantasies of power involving drugs and alcohol that I liken in the chapter to a lot of these songs similarly about madness and about death as related to the kind of fantasies that the drug songs are trying to capture. And that becomes a different kind of fantasy, a fantasy not of power, but of escape. And you see these images of escape in the videos again and again about breaking chains and getting out of padded rooms and getting out of hospitals and all these other kinds of things. When you get to X for explicit and sexuality, that is a whole different kind and set of fantasies, particularly male fantasies about images of women and relationships. But then when you get to O for Occult, this is in some ways the greatest power fantasy of all. It's able to use this image of Satan as kind of the ultimate form of rebellion, that Satan rebelled against God. During the Romantic period, Satan and Prometheus were seen as these very powerful symbols of freedom and individuality, individualism, working against tyranny. So it's not surprising in some ways that teenagers, heavy metal bands, and going all the way back, because in that chapter I sort of start with Robert Johnson, maybe the original American who is likened to this deal with the devil for his blues albums in the 1920s, and how these are amazing fantasies of power. That you get somebody like Robert Johnson, who is, black in the segregated South, and that these songs about the devil arguably give him this amazing notoriety, this way of thinking and talking about power in a way that in conventional means he can't. Jump ahead to the late 1960s, early 1970s, Black Sabbath do something very similar. Working class guys, not a lot of prospects in Birmingham, England, resigned to factory work. These images of the occult and the devil give them this tremendous amount of power. And then jump ahead to the 80s, where it's easy in some ways to liken the use of Satan as an image to arguably the two greatest works of literature in the entire Western canon, Dante's Inferno and John Milton's Paradise Lost, where we get these, again, very powerful images of justice in the afterlife, these powerful images of rebellion. This whole way in which the occult, in some ways, let's say, Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost really does behave a lot like a teenager who's been sent to his room. His room is hell, but that's okay. He's been replaced by his father's new favorites, Adam and Eve, in paradise, and he wants nothing more than to get something like revenge on them. It's not so different than any number of different revenge scenarios in literature and in heavy metal. So to me, these images are in some ways perfectly crafted. On the other hand, you get a group like Slayer, who also wrote a lot about hell, but they're not thinking of it exactly like a fantasy. They're closer to what Jean-Paul Sartre wrote in No Exit, where hell is on earth, hell is other people. In some ways, that's not a fantasy at all. It's a way of dealing with the challenges of life as opposed to after death. So in some ways, I've always liked the occult side of these things. Not because I'm so interested in Satan or anything like that, although I guess if I wrote a whole chapter about it, I guess I am. But the way in which it really encompasses so many different things, including, again, we've got Paradise Lost and the Inferno, but we also have Faust and the Faust story, and the way Faust can be taught as part of this Western canon again and again. And nobody's thinking Faust is going to encourage kids to make deals with the devil. It is very much the opposite. It is a kind of cautionary tale of the so-called Faustian bargain. And I don't think listeners, young people, were given enough credit for understanding those things, for understanding that these were powerful metaphors and acts of the imagination. They were in literature, they were in heavy metal.
The book has been out how long now?
Only a little bit over a month.
Yeah, so you have 5-star reviews so far, which is terrific. How long did it take you to write the book?
Well, there's the short answer and the long answer, but in terms of time, not explanation. The short answer is I was granted a sabbatical. Thank you, Maryville University. I had one semester off to work on this, and I thought to myself, I am going to finish this book in one semester, which, for anybody who's worked on a book, I had 4 months before I had to get back to work. And I did wind up writing about 80% of it in 4 months, which I was thrilled about. I got into excellent writing habits for all the writers out there. I woke up at the same time every day. I put the same number of hours in. I took a break. I wrote again. I kept track of how many words I wrote every day. I mean, just all the things that are supposed to be good habits, because I knew if I didn't finish the draft, in my 4 months, I might never finish it. The longer
What were you?
answer. Oh, go ahead.
Let me just ask you before you get to the long answer, which obviously decades.
Yeah, that's the
Uh,
long answer.
there you go, decades of accumulated knowledge and observation. But those habits, what time did you get up? How many hours of work? What was your word count target per day, and so on?
Yeah. I mean, I don't like getting up early or anything, but I got up at like 7. I thought that was pretty good.
Hmm.
I had some coffee. I sat with my dog. I did the New York Times puzzles. And then I always got to work by the latest 9 o'clock. Like I actually really thought of it kind of like a 9 to 5 job. And I would compose. Usually, not right away. Usually, after once I got into the swing of things, I would read what I wrote the day before and kind of pick it up from there. So it would be a little bit of first wave of revision and then composing in the second half of the day. But to me, the interesting thing that I did was I got the idea for the chapters and the outline pretty early, and I did not complete any one section all at once. I worked on each section overall so that each section, each chapter got a little bit longer and a little bit longer and a little bit longer until finally there were just gaps left and I would go back and fill in the gaps. The idea for that was that I am very bad at following instructions and I am very bad at, let's say, putting together IKEA style furniture. I always mess it up. And one of the rules for IKEA style furniture is you don't put the whole thing together and tighten all of it until you've got the layout and everything is put together loosely. So that was kind of my model for this, is if I complete a chapter, but then later on I do something that totally works against what I did earlier in a way that I can't salvage, I'll feel like I wasted it. I did wind up cutting well over 5,000 and 6,000 words from it. So that's not to say that I, didn't find some areas that needed to go, but I really was thinking in terms of how to make this flow as cohesively as possible from beginning to end so that it rewarded reading it from beginning to end, unlike other kinds of academic books where people will dip in and out because they'll go to the index and they'll see that I wrote about Don DeLillo on 15 different pages and they're writing about Don DeLillo. And so they'll just kind of quote mine my 15 pages about DeLillo and then move on. I really did think of this as a book that academics who are interested in the topics might read, but also maybe even regular people who are interested in literature, heavy metal, or the 80s, or any combination of those things might actually look at and read from beginning to end. So that was the approach to writing it. And then, of course, the long answer is right. In my head, I've been working on this for decades. I really, there are a number of other very good books about heavy metal out there. Most of them are like history of books. There are 2 excellent oral histories related to heavy metal, but I wanted to write something that I felt like was absolutely filtered through my own experience as an 80s heavy metal teen, as somebody who aspired to be a rock star in the 80s, learned music, wrote music, memorized a lot of these lyrics, took the songs deadly seriously, then stepped away, then taught literature without quite realizing that I was part of a pretty obvious pipeline, that I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, started reading, took a break from Dungeons and Dragons and reading and just played heavy metal, went back to reading, but that all of these things were part of a longer continuum, that I've been teaching for a long time, and that all of these things seem to me to be connected in valuable ways, as opposed to, the sort of dual identity, double life. Heavy metal is anti-intellectual and literature is anti-rebellion. And neither one of those things is true.
Mm. Now, have you sent the book to any of the people implicated in this, like Dee Snider and so on?
I did not, except for one, and this is a funny thing. The current guitar player of Guns N' Roses, who's not Slash, Richard Fortus, lives in my neighborhood, and I don't know him, but I know about 25 people who do know him. And they were all saying, you've got to give Richard a copy of the book. So I dropped it off in his mailbox after messaging him saying, I wrote this book. There's a lot about Guns N' Roses in it. You want to read it? He said, sure. I put it in his mailbox. I still haven't met Richard Fortus, but hope to one of these days. And I haven't heard anything back. The other person is the sort of podcaster, DJ, Sirius XM personality, Eddie Trunk. Through a connection, I did send a book to him. I have not heard anything yet either. But maybe one of these days, Richard Fortus, Eddie Trunk, or even Dee Snider will open up the book and let me know what they think.
Right. Yeah. Wouldn't that be great? Where do you want the book to go from here? I mean, you want more five-star reviews. You want it to sell really well. You want great reviews. Is there anything beyond that? Is there something that you'd like to see happen with? I don't know that it lends itself to cinema, but a documentary, perhaps. What do you think?
I mean, mainly as a person who played music for a long time, who still plays music now, who went into English, who went into teaching, I have never in my life made a decision based on money, and it shows. So I'm
Hmm.
not really expecting to make a fortune or anything off this book, but I would love to just get it into as many readers' hands as possible. I would love for people to read it, think about it. One of the things that I was excited about in working on this was, again, these songs have been around for a while. There's no shortage of people who have thought about or wrote about these lyrics, but I really did think that I had something to add and contribute to our understanding of these songs and this genre. And I hope that people who are interested read the book and feel that way too. They feel as though, you can listen to the music and people have been listening to the music for decades, but that this does something else. This helps them to think about literature and heavy metal in ways that they had not quite before. So if there are plenty of people out there that are able to get their hands on the book, actually read the thing, actually, feel free to let me know what you think. Certainly, there are some things to disagree with in the book. I'm waiting for if D. Snyder does contact me, it will be to tell me that I am absolutely wrong and Under the Blade really is about dental surgery. And I'll say, I'm so happy to hear from you. There is an anecdote in the footnotes of all places about that when I was first experimenting with writing about music in 2012, I had a blog, as many of us did in 2012 and earlier, and I experimented with some of what winds up in this book in a, I think, better form about what happens when people gender swap the lyrics. So Joan Jett's I Love Rock and Roll was originally recorded by another previous band lost to history called The Arrows. The Arrows had a minor hit with it, but Joan Jett, of course, had a monstrous decade-spanning hit with I Love Rock and Roll. And I analyzed the way, which is, and this, a version of this is in the book, the way in which when Joan Jett sings about, sort of leering at a 17-year-old, it doesn't really come off like anything because this is very much a song about love for rock and roll, not boys. But when Alan Merrill, the singer of the Arrow, sings it, yeah, this sounds a lot like a pretty typical, homage to the joys of jailbait with a creepy older guy leering at a 17-year-old girl.
Mm.
And amazingly enough, Alan Merrill of the Arrows read it and wrote to me, and he called me names, and he said I was ugly, and all sorts of other stuff in this message. And I was delighted to receive it, which I told him. I said, I am so delighted that you read what I wrote and responded to it. I can't even begin to express my appreciation. And he did not write back again. But I absolutely meant it. I didn't care that he called me a lot of mean names.
Right. Yeah. 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 Um, so are the 1980s, is that decade a unique decade, or could you see yourself doing another book of this style for the 70s or the 90s or the 60s?
Mhm. I mean, in terms of age and my experience, I do straddle the 90s. So I turned 20 in 1991. I was still playing music. I was still listening to music. The end of the book sort of acknowledges the end of the era of heavy metal and the usual conventional wisdom that Nirvana and grunge came along and kind of wiped out all this music. But I suggest in the end that that's not really my sense of what happened. That the decade used like to use the word decadence. Motley Crue had a best of album that came out, I think, in 1991 called Decade of Decadence. And that is the right word to use in that a decadent phase in literature does usually signal the end or the decline to be replaced by the next thing. And I loved the quote unquote grunge bands that seemed to replace 80s heavy metal because I didn't really read them as all that different. When Alice in Chains came along, they were long-haired guys playing heavy music with heavy guitars, singing about being trapped, just like the early 80s rockers were singing about being trapped and needing to escape. Nirvana, similarly, Kurt Cobain was very unhappy with the production of Nevermind because he was worried that it sounded like a Motley Crue record. And to me, that wasn't a problem. That was a plus. Um, and so I can see looking at the early 90s as a potential next project. I don't, though, think that the same thesis fits. I would need to sort of figure out what is the way that I want to think and talk about that music that's distinct from the way I talked about the 80s music.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it would be a different approach, but I could, just kind of take a decade and do this kind of analysis of music and slash literature if you really see the true connection there. Does that mean there is no next project, or are you thinking in terms of a whether it's music and literature or just something else? Do you have a next project in mind?
I mean, the closest thing to a next project probably really is this 90s rock thing, but I have not found my footing. I will say, even for the book, when I first decided this is what I wanted to do, I didn't have my footing for that either. I was really thinking something along the lines of, 80 songs about the 80s, and I do this just kind of song by song analysis. And as I was walking my dog, I was thinking, that's going to get repetitive. That doesn't really have a thesis to it. That doesn't lend itself to being read from beginning to end. And then I remembered the PMRC and their categories. And that really was one of these like moments where I realized that's how to organize the book. Take the objections to heavy metal and turn them around. And I have not had that moment with the 90s music. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. But I definitely feel like I've got potentially another book about heavy music in me. As you mentioned, I've written a bunch of previous books, mainly about Don DeLillo. I edited a collection of essays with Bob Batchelor about Michael Chabon. My 2016 book isn't about any of this stuff at all. It's about literature and pop culture in the wake of 9/11, which I'm actually very happy and proud of that book, but it is not a fun read, as you might expect. So I am thinking about a little bit, how do I perpetuate this idea of writing about music, but again, in my lane, in the literature lane, not as a music journalist, not as a musicologist.
Yes, I get it. Absolutely. So the name of the book again is Rock of Pages, and it's out. And if you're more auditory than you are visual, there's also an audio edition on Audible and maybe some other places. So yeah, you can get your hands on that. Jesse Kavadlo has been my guest, and he is the author of Rock of Pages. What a interesting take on things, Jesse, and it's been a pleasure reconnecting with you. I congratulate you on the book and the 5-star reviews, and I wish you best of luck with the Rock of Pages.
Hey, thanks so much, Mike. Yeah, and if any listeners are interested and you pick up the book and you want to write to me, I am the only person with this name in the whole world. I have a website. Write to me. I'd love to hear what people think about the book.
And you will find the website URL in the episode notes to make it easy for you. Thanks a million, Jesse.
Hey, thank you so much.